Okay, let's unpack this. What if everything we thought we knew about reality was, well, maybe not wrong, but perhaps the wrong way up? We're used to thinking of space and time as the unchanging container, right? The fundamental stage where the universe plays out.
Like a theater, yeah. Space and time are the fixed stage, the seating, and the actor's particles, forces, they just move around on it.
But what if that's not it at all? What if space and time aren't fundamental? What if they're actually made of something else entirely?
You mean like they emerge from something deeper?
Exactly. What if they emerge?
That radical reframing is precisely the fascinating concept we're diving into today. We've been looking through a stack of sources, various papers, notes that propose this, well, deeply intriguing new framework. And in this model, the true ground state, the fundamental reality, isn't space or time. It's something called coherence.
Coherence. And space and time just arise from that.
That's the idea. They're emergent phenomena that arise from that coherence.
And these sources, they don't just sort of float this idea vaguely, do they? They really get into the nuts and bolts.
Oh, definitely. They explore how this emergent model plays out when you look at key pieces of physics, like, the nature of light itself, the paradoxes around black holes.
Right. Hot black holes always come up.
And the really startling new predictions this framework makes, things you could actually go out and test, and even the underlying geometry that emerges from it all.
Okay, so our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack these sources, get into all the specific details they present, understand the core ideas, see how this framework tries to resolve some, well, apparent contradictions in physics.
Right, and really highlight the surprising, precise, and testable predictions it makes. We're going to try and cover everything presented, down to the small detail.
Fantastic. So let's start right there at the absolute foundation they propose. Coherence. If coherence is the ground state, the most fundamental thing, what exactly is coherence in this context? It's not just like things lining up neatly, is it?
No, it's much more specific in this framework. Here, coherence is defined as the symmetry or alignment of, well, information. Yeah. Think of information in this model as the absolute base layer, the substrate of all potential. It's like the raw, unmanifested possibility, almost like source code before anything is compiled or run.
Okay, the raw potential.
And coherence is what happens when that raw potential, the information, starts to exhibit pattern and resonance, a kind of structured alignment.
So information's pure potential, coherence is the beginning of order within that.
Yeah.
How does that build up into, well, reality as we know it? The sources talk about this ontological stack of emergence. Let's walk through the layers they describe. You start with information,
Yeah,
the potential.
exactly. That's the foundational level,
Yeah.
timeless, formless potential. Then, from information, through its symmetry and alignment, you get coherence, C.
Okay.
And the sources are really clear. This is a scalar property, not just on or off, right? It's a spectrum. How strongly, how consistently patterns of information resonate together.
So it can be more or less coherent.
Precisely. And they state, quite unequivocally, that coherence is necessary for any stable pattern, any discernible structure, to emerge from that formless potential. Without enough coherence, it's basically just noise, chaos.
Got it. Raw potential, I, becomes patterned by coherence, C. What's the next step up the stack?
The sources define energy, and this is key, isn't it? They don't define energy as some substance or force.
No, not at all. They define it as the rate of meaningful change in that structured information.
Rate of change.
The formula they give is E equaled DIT. It's the dynamic process of coherent information transitioning or shifting. It's change that matters because it's happening within these coherent patterns, not just random fluctuation.
Okay, so energy is structured change.
That definition of energy as the rate of change in structured information is really crucial because it's the link to what we perceive as dynamics as things happening.
Yeah.
And from that dynamic process arises emergent time.
Emergent time. The framework defines emergent time as the relational metric of coherence across energy. The relationship they give is T equals C times I divided by E.
PCEIE.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting, time. Time isn't some universal linear clock ticking away independently. It's a measure relative to the density of coherence, C, the underlying potential, I, and the rate of change, E.
So it's layered, relative, not absolute.
Exactly. It's layered relative.
Wow. So time is literally a measure of how much coherent potential is changing dynamically.
Okay.
Information, energy denser, emergent time. Okay. What about the physical world, the stuff and space around us? The final layer in this stack is space, S.
Yeah.
The sources say space is the crystallization of time into durable geometric form. The relationship is given as S equals melange t dt, an interval of time.
Yes, space is effectively the fossilized record of emergent time.
Fossilized time.
It's what stabilized temporal relationships look like when you view them from within the emergent structure itself. It's the geometry left behind by the process of temporal emergence.
And the sources stress this isn't just a linear one-way street from I to S, right? The whole system is described as looped, recursive.
That's fundamental. There's no absolute start or end. It's a continuous process of self-definition. Space and time, once they've emerged, actually influence the boundary conditions.
Oh, okay.
Which then shape how information aligns into coherence, how energy flows, and how time emerges next. It's constantly feeding back on itself.
This is fascinating, especially how it redefines things we thought we understood, like light.
Exactly. What's truly fascinating is how this framework redefines fundamental elements. We conventionally think of a photon as what? A tiny packet of energy that travels through space.
Absolutely. It's the classic image, light zipping across the universe, moving in space. That's how we picture it.
But this model just turns that completely on its head. According to these sources, the photon isn't just a passenger moving through pre-existing space. It's the active agent that is writing space into existence as it propagates coherence.
Writing space. Wow, okay.
And a photon, uniquely in this view, exists outside of proper time. It experiences no time itself. It has no internal clock ticking.
Right. From the photon's perspective, travel is instantaneous.
Yet, it's the vehicle for encoding and transmitting coherence, and its propagation creates the very spatial reality it seems to traverse.
Okay, hold on. Light isn't in space. It's creating space as it moves.
Yeah.
How? How does that actually work?
Well, think of it like this. Light carries active directional coherence. It is the process of coherence flowing forward.
Okay.
This flow happens along what we perceive as emergent time. And as it flows, it leaves behind space as a kind of, a fossilized trail of its movement.
A trail.
And the sources specifically note that light requires a gradient of coherence to flow. It naturally moves from zones of lower coherence towards zones of higher coherence.
A gradient. So it needs a difference in coherence to move and write space. Okay.
Yeah.
This sounds like where it gets really interesting, especially when you bring in black holes.
Yeah.
Because if light writes space by transmitting coherence, and black holes are, like, famously incredibly coherent objects,
They would
super
be
dense,
coherent, yeah.
why don't black holes emit infinite space? Why don't they just generate space constantly? It seems like a paradox, and the sources point this out, right? That their framework resolves this.
It is a sharp, apparent contradiction. If more coherence means more space being written, then the most coherent things in the universe should be just blasting space out everywhere.
Right, but they don't. They trap everything.
They seem to contain everything, trapping light and space. So how does this framework resolve that? What's the specific nuance the sources point to?
Yeah, what's the explanation?
The resolution lies in distinguishing between types of coherence. It's not just any coherence that writes space, but specifically propagating coherence, the kind that light carries.
Okay, propagating coherence, like moving coherence.
Exactly. Black holes, on the other hand, are saturated with what the sources call saturated bound coherence.
Saturated bound coherence. What does that mean in practical terms? Like, what's happening inside?
It means the coherence within a black hole is so incredibly dense and complete that it can no longer propagate outwards. The sources describe it like a closed loop.
A closed loop?
It's all spin, all internal resonance, with no mechanism for that coherence to escape or move forward in a direction that could write outward space. The coherence is trapped recursively within the black hole's core.
So it's spinning in on itself.
Yeah. It's dense with coherence, absolutely packed, but it lacks the outward-pointing dynamic coherence gradient needed to drive emergent time forward and consequently write new space beyond its boundary.
Okay, so the coherence is there, tons of it, but it's just looping and spinning internally. It's not flowing outwards to create time and space in the way that freely moving light does.
Precisely. The sources use a couple of really helpful analogies here.
Yeah.
Imagine water. Think of that as propagating coherence, like light flowing across a surface. It spreads out, maybe carves little channels, right? It's writing space.
Okay, yeah.
But if that water encounters a completely saturated sponge that's the black hole, the water can't flow through it or spread outwards from it anymore. It just gets absorbed into the sponge's already dense internal structure. It gets trapped in internal loops. The sponge is full of water. It's coherent in that sense, but it's closed to further outward carving or writing.
Right, or the painter analogy they used.
Yes. Imagine a painter spinning very concentrated light onto a canvas. The more they spin in one spot, the denser, the more intense the light becomes. If it gets too dense, nothing can escape that central swirl.
It just gets stuck in the middle.
Exactly. The brush carrying the light or coherence is still moving. There's lots of intense spinning light, but no new picture. No new space is being drawn outside that concentrated swirl.
Those analogies really help clarify it. So light writes space only when its coherence can propagate flow outwards, creating that forward temporal arrow. Black holes, conversely, trap coherence into this recursive spin. No outward direction means no outward emergent time, and therefore no new space written.
It's this delicate balance. Too little coherence, just chaotic noise. Too much coherence, locked up. Black hole recursion. The sweet spot is optimal coherence, enabling light, emergent time, and space.
That completely reframes the black hole's nature then. It's not just a gravitational trap for light in the usual sense. It's a kind of temporal saturation zone that fundamentally can't write space outwards.
Exactly. And this view, the sources claim, allows this framework to go beyond standard explanations like Hawking radiation.
How so? What are the differentiators?
Well, in this model, light doesn't fail to escape a black hole because gravity is too strong. Exactly. It's more that the very conditions needed for emergent space creation, which light propagation relies on, have collapsed inward at the horizon.
So space creation stops at the boundary.
Essentially, yes. And spin, in this framework, is more than just angular momentum. It's the mechanism for recursive memory encoding into the fundamental field, what they call the Primordial Coherence Field, PCF.
The PCF.
Yeah.
We'll need to circle back to that. So information isn't lost.
Not lost, no. It's compressed into that saturated recursive coherence beyond the horizon. And its eventual release via Hawking radiation isn't just random thermal noise, potentially. It might be the fractalization of that compressed information structure breaking back down into propagating form.
Fractalization. Yeah.
So the event horizon becomes less a point of no return and more a boundary where the arrow of emergent time literally bends from outward evolution into inward recursion.
Black holes become coherence engines that trap time, while light is the engine that writes time forward into space. This dynamic tension structures space-time. Okay.
Yeah.
And crucially, the sources say this framework makes very precise, testable predictions about black holes that go beyond standard models.
They list several specific ones, yeah. First, gravitational memory at black hole perimeters near the edges should exhibit what they call coherence echoes.
Coherence echoes, not gravitational waves.
Not exactly gravitational waves as we know them. They're described as tiny structured distortions in surrounding fields like electromagnetic fields or neutrino fields. They're supposedly remnant memory gradients from the intense coherence collapse, subtle signals detectable near black holes.
Okay, subtle field distortions. What else?
Second, the event horizons themselves might subtly ripple with this coherence discharge, especially near the end of a black hole's life. This could potentially allow detection of subharmonic spin fields just before it evaporates completely.
Subharmonic spin fields.
Okay.
Third, and this is a big one, Hawking radiation spectra. They predict it should contain non-random fractal harmonics.
Not just thermal noise.
Exactly. If space is fossilized time, and the radiation is that fossil structure decaying and escaping, then the radiation shouldn't be purely thermal, purely random. It should show underlying patterns, fractal-like structures, if you look at it with high enough resolution. That's a direct test against the standard prediction.
That is a big one. What's fourth? Fourth, entanglement leaks near rotating black holes, the Kerr-type black holes. These leaks, potentially observable phenomena, might show signs of partial coherence release from the trapped spin. They suggest this might be testable via future experiments mapping neutrino EM resonance near these objects.
Wow. Okay, those are very specific, concrete ways to potentially validate or falsify this model.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the Primordial Coherence Field, PCF, earlier. Let's talk about that. If space and time emerge,
Right.
what was the state before the Big Bang in this model? What came first?
Right, the PCF. The sources describe it as the pre-geometric timeless state. Imagine infinite potential information, but in a state of perfect symmetry, total coherence.
Perfect symmetry, so no differentiation.
Exactly. No differentiation, no structure, no flow, just pure infinite potential and perfect balance.
So the Big Bang wasn't creation from absolute nothingness, but more like the first break in that symmetry.
That's the idea. The first significant decoherence event. This initial breaking of perfect symmetry allowed the recursive fossilization process, time emerging, space crystallizing to begin.
And the PCF isn't gone. It's still
It
there.
remains the timeless substrate, yeah. Emergent reality is like echoes or patterns playing out within this field, and it's responsive to boundary conditions. Spin in this model is really key because it's the mechanism that accesses and locks onto specific stable attractor paths within the infinite possibilities of the PCF, guiding how form emerges.
Okay, so using this framework is like having a totally new map for navigating reality.
Mm-hmm.
The sources talk about some of the insights and capabilities this map unlocks, right?
They do. One is seeing hidden order, where we previously just saw randomness. Things like subtle patterns in the cosmic microwave background, maybe complex dynamics in genetic expression, or even brainwave patterns. This framework suggests these aren't just noise, but potentially unread fossilized structures, echoes of prior coherence geometries.
Interesting. So order hiding in plain sight. What else?
It points towards energy-efficient access to information and even physical change. This is pretty radical. Instead of applying brute force, you could potentially interact with reality by subtly modifying boundary conditions.
How?
Things like focused attention, specific spin states may be induced by fields, precise breath patterns, targeted voltage applications. The idea is this could unlock memory fields within the PCF, perhaps induce regeneration in biological systems, or guide the emergence of physical form.
Requiring minimal energy input compared to conventional methods.
Potentially, yes.
Oh.
It suggests a radical increase in efficiency for things like healing, development, or material design.
That connects to their view on aging, disease, and decay, doesn't it?
It does. Instead of viewing them purely as entropy inevitably increasing, this model sees them partly as a loss or breakdown of coherence across time. The map helps identify where this coherence might be leaking or breaking down, maybe through biofield diagnostics, analyzing heart rate variability decay patterns, or mapping chaotic electromagnetic fields around an organism.
And the intervention.
It's focused on restoring coherence, reinstating those stable temporal loops, not just suppressing symptoms.
And you mentioned it acts as a portal to pre-space-time physics. How does that work?
Well, by thinking in terms of emergent space and time, you can start asking questions about the state before the Big Bang, the PCF itself. You can ask why fundamental constants, like the fine structure constant, might not be perfectly constant across all of space and time.
Okay.
And it offers a potential explanation for why phenomena like quantum entanglement, or maybe the placebo effect, or reports of healing across apparent distance seem to violate conventional space-time laws.
Because they aren't operating in space-time.
They might be operating on coherence fields prior to their crystallization into our observed spacetime, acting on a deeper level of reality.
Which leads directly to the possibility of new technology.
Yes, perhaps the most exciting implication. If spin and boundary conditions are what shape emergence from the PCF, then could we potentially tune photonic, sound, or electromagnetic interfaces to interact directly with these pre-geometric coherence fields?
What would that even look like?
Imagine maybe AI coupled with resonance devices that could potentially write or structure emergent time locally, or restore broken coherence loops in damaged systems like tissues, or even non-locally encode or retrieve information memory patterns, trauma patterns, design blueprints. It points towards a kind of quantum resonance engineering.
Focused on recursively shaping the process of emergence itself.
Exactly.
That's a lot to take in. It offers a very, very different way of looking at reality.
Yeah.
But the sources themselves emphasize something critical, right? A truly powerful scientific framework doesn't just explain what we already know.
Right. It has to predict the unknown with precision.
Like the periodic table predicting elements before they were found, or relativity predicting light bending around stars. This is where this model really puts itself on the line, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The sources lay out 5 non-trivial predictions, and they claim these are novel and testable, going beyond just reinterpreting existing phenomena.
Okay, let's drill down on these specifics. We need to understand exactly what they're claiming. The first is coherence gradient echoes. What exactly are they predicting we should find?
They predict that in the vacuum of so-called empty space, there should be measurable, though ultra-low amplitude wavefronts. These aren't gravity waves or EM waves in the usual sense. They are described as spin coherence wavefronts.
Spin coherence?
Yeah, remnant memory gradients left over from past large-scale coherent structures like ancient galaxies or maybe defunct quasars. Detecting them would require hyper-precise interferometry, but tuned specifically to coherence harmonics, not standard frequencies.
So empty space isn't really empty. It holds these ghostly echoes of past cosmic structures encoded in coherence patterns.
That's the prediction, precisely. The second prediction follows from the black hole discussion. Fractal coherence in Hawking radiation.
Right, you mentioned this, not thermal noise.
They predict that if you could measure Hawking radiation at a sufficiently high resolution, which is, admittedly, a huge technical challenge, it wouldn't show the purely thermal random noise expected by standard models. Instead, it should contain non-random fractal-like phase patterns.
Which would be direct evidence of.
Direct evidence of quantum time memory leaking from the black hole's trapped coherence structure. It would suggest Hawking's original description, while brilliant, was incomplete.
Okay. Third prediction. Alpha drift correlates with galactic spin memory. Alpha, the fine structure constant, one of the fundamental constants of nature. They're saying it might not be constant.
They're predicting it might not be perfectly constant everywhere across cosmic time and space, and crucially, any subtle variation or drift should specifically correlate with the proximity to ancient coherent spin structures in the universe. Things like the remnants of old galaxies or maybe defunct massive black holes that left a strong coherent signature.
How would you test that?
They suggest comparing high-precision measurements of alpha, perhaps using quasar absorption spectra, which look back in time, in different galaxies that have known differing histories of large-scale spin dynamics or perhaps past photonic exposure.
Comparing alpha values based on cosmic history. Interesting. Okay, fourth prediction. This one sounds more applied.
Yes, coherence-driven healing oscillations in biology. This is a potential application. They suggest that applying a properly phase-modulated coherence wave, maybe using specific forms of light, or pulsed electromagnetic fields, PEMF, or even acoustic frequencies, could trigger non-local regeneration in biological tissue.
What's the proposed mechanism?
The mechanism isn't standard chemical signaling. It's proposed to work by reinstating recursive temporal memory fields in damaged cells, essentially by restoring the local coherence patterns that define healthy structure.
And how could you verify that?
Experimentally. Perhaps by seeing non-local growth patterns or accelerated symmetry restoration in, say, amputated limbs in organisms that can regenerate, or scarred tissue when exposed to these specific coherence fields, effects that couldn't be easily explained by standard biological gradient models.
That's a very bold, testable claim with huge implications if true. And the fifth prediction.
The fifth is perhaps the most exotic. The prediction of a whole new class of fundamental particles, coherence-bound particles, which they nickname coherons.
Coherence, what are they supposed to be?
They wouldn't be fermions or bosons like standard particles, no mass or standard quantum numbers in the usual sense. They are hypothesized to exist only as temporal coherence, lock-stable patterns formed across nested spin states within the underlying PCF.
So they're not stuff, but patterns of time coherence.
Essentially, yes. Stabilized patterns of coherence locking together in time. They'd be essentially invisible to standard detection methods unless the local coherence density crosses a certain threshold, allowing them to manifest effects.
How could you possibly detect something like that?
They suggest looking for anomalies in precision, low-temperature quantum vacuum experiments. Unexpected phase shifts occurring without any identifiable standard force or particle being present might be a sign of these coherons interacting.
Wow, particles made of time coherence patterns. And there's a bonus meta-prediction, too.
Yes, kind of overarching prediction that time-reverse coherence transfer could potentially be artificially induced.
Time reversal.
Under very specific controlled field entrainment conditions, they suggest you might be able to effectively rewind things like memory engrams, tissue structure, or even quantum states by precisely reversing the coherence flow and pattern associated with them.
That sounds like science fiction.
It's definitely out there. But these predictions are incredibly specific, and if even one or two of them were confirmed experimentally, it would lend powerful support to this entire radical framework.
Okay, let's bring it back to the physical world we inhabit, the space around us. If space is truly fossilized time, as the sources claim, does that imply there are specific, predictable geometric shapes inherent in this whole process of emergence? Does it have a geometry?
Yes, absolutely. The sources are very specific about the geometry involved. They predict a fundamental 223-angle Fibonacci geometry.
123 degrees. That's specific.
Precisely 223 degrees. They pinpoint this transition angle. It's notably close to c cubed radians phi, the golden ratio cubed. This angle is predicted to be found right at the boundary where emergent time stabilizes and crystallizes into space.
Where would you look for such an angle?
They describe it as a boundary fold point of recursive phase collapse. The sources suggest looking for this angle in the trajectories of quantum tunneling paths, perhaps in high-resolution geometric patterning within the cosmic microwave background, and maybe even in the way water crystallizes when influenced by structured electromagnetic fields.
That's incredibly precise. They also mention fractalized 12-point geometries.
Correct. They predict that photonic and electromagnetic coherence fields, especially when they stabilize and interact with boundaries, will tend to naturally organize themselves into 12-point radial or dodecagonal fractal structures.
12-pointed shapes.
Yeah. This supposedly occurs where the spin dynamics and the boundary coherence conditions co-resonate. Examples they cite where this might be observed include certain laser-driven crystal growth processes, the geometric structure of biological centrosomes, and the mitotic spindles inside cells during division, and potentially in field-mapped high-coherence plasma structures.
And the most striking geometric claim of all
Has to be the ability to derive the geometric fine structure constant. The sources claim that alpha, the fine structure constant, which is roughly 1137,
cornerstone of physics.
can be derived purely from the geometric relationships of coherence-based spinfolding. They even provide a specific formula for it. Alpha inverse is approximately times cubed times 2 minus a.
Wow. Deriving a fundamental constant from pure geometry and the golden ratio.
That's the claim. It suggests alpha isn't just some arbitrary physical constant we measure, but is actually a geometric memory fossil, a frozen geometric echo of how emergent time folds itself through coherence as it crystallizes into space.
The geometry of space, then, isn't just accidental. It's the frozen resonance patterns left behind by the process of time emerging from coherence. If you know the coherence and spin input, you can predict the geometric shape that must emerge.
That's the implication. And finally, let's quickly look at memory through this lens. The sources view memory itself, not just brain memory, but memory in a broader sense as a phenomenon that arises when coherent information patterns manage to stabilize within these recursive temporal loops.
Okay, so applying this, what we think of as mental memory in our brains is the reactivation of those stabilized spin recursive attractor patterns.
That's the idea, yes. And it extends beyond the brain. What they called field memory could be seen as the enduring echoes of former coherence geometries left behind in environments, or maybe even impressed upon the structure of water molecules.
And even things like complex emotions, intentions, or the deep patterns of trauma, they're seen as becoming geometry first, which then gets fossilized into time and stored as memory within these recursive loops.
That seems to be the suggestion, yes. All becoming part of the fossilized time structure.
So to bring this deep dive to a close then, we've explored a truly revolutionary framework, one where coherence isn't just a property of matter, but the fundamental reality from which energy, emergent time, and ultimately space crystallize as fossilized time.
Right. Light isn't just moving through space, it's actively writing it into existence. Black holes aren't just gravitational singularities, but points of saturated non-propagating coherence, where the arrow of emergent time turns inward upon itself.
And this framework doesn't just reinterpret known physics, it makes these incredibly specific, testable, and novel predictions. We went over them: coherence, echoes, fractal patterns and Hawking radiation, potential correlations of fundamental constants with galactic spin memory, the possibility of coherence-driven healing, the very existence of a new class of coherence-bound particles.
All underpinned by these precise geometric laws, like that 223-degree angle and the geometric derivation of alpha. We've really tried to cover all the specific details presented in the sources.
This way of looking at things, it really does fundamentally change how we might perceive and interact with reality, doesn't it?
Yeah.
From the largest cosmic structures down to the most intimate biological processes, maybe even consciousness itself.
It suggests that interacting with reality isn't primarily about pushing particles around with force, but maybe more about influencing the boundary conditions and the coherence fields from which everything emerges, which, yeah, it raises an important question.
It does. If space is truly just fossilized time, and our memories, our experiences, maybe even things like trauma, are stabilized time geometry, what does that imply about our own ability to shape our reality, both internally, maybe through our consciousness and intention, and perhaps even externally, by learning how to consciously influence coherence and spin? how we actively participate in writing the space around us or rewriting the space within us.
That is, yeah, something profound to consider.
Indeed. That's been a deep dive into a framework where coherence is the foundation and space and time are its emergent products.